Welcome to the Exec Exchange, 15-minute podcast in which a leader from the water sector shares a story to inspire, educate, and inform other water sector leaders from across the globe. My name is Piers Clark, and today my guest is Steve Capewell from Goulburn Valley Water. Steve, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Piers. It's great to be part of this initiative.
Well, as you probably know, we always start with a little bit of background on our speaker. And the beauty of you is that you have experience across a couple of water companies in Australia. So tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, so I came to my current role here as the managing director of Goulburn Valley Water in Victoria back in late 2020, so about touch over 4 years ago now. It was actually right in the middle of the pandemic, so that was a real challenge being a new managing director in a water utility on the other side of the continent, because I'm originally from Perth in Western Australia. Worked through that, and I've had a wonderful time ever since.
And you worked in Perth, hadn't you?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm originally from Perth, which for your international listeners is on the west coast of Australia, where I'm based now on the east coast, 2,800 kilometres away. I grew up in Perth, studied metallurgy and chemical engineering at university. I went on to do a PhD. First worked in an alumina refinery, in fact, and got really interested in the water circuit there and its interaction with the process, and then had an opportunity to go to municipal water treatment. And that's when I joined the Water Corporation in Western Australia back in 2002. And again, for your listeners, the Water Corporation is the single water utility covering the entire state, Western Australia, some 2.5 million square kilometres, or about 975,000 square miles. So very, very large business. And I was there for the next 18 years.
And so I'm hoping that we can do a podcast with the man at the head of Water Corp at some point, because of course that's a very unique water utility. Very unique, very unique. It's a unique water utility. Now let's talk about Goulburn Valley then. So Goulburn Valley is it's sort of in the breadbasket, or maybe the fruit bowl, we should call it, of Australia. Tell us a bit about where is Goulburn Valley? How big an area do you serve? What's your client base look like?
Yeah, so we're in regional Victoria. It's one of 18 water corporations in this state. So a very different water industry structure here compared to Western Australia. Operating area of about 25,000 square kilometres, 54 towns, population served of about 135,000 people. But I guess the uniqueness of the Goulburn Valley is we're positioned in the centre of the food bowl, Victoria, as you've said. Is our region produces half of the state's fruit, about a quarter of all the milk that's produced in Australia comes out of this region, significant international exports of food and agricultural products. A regional economy in the order of $3.5 billion
And,
per year. So
and I think when we met, you told me, because I had the privilege of visiting you recently, and when we met, you said something like, almost every household in the world will at some point in the day have produce that will have come from the Goulburn Valley region, fruit juice and things like that.
yes, yeah, I think if you look in the pantry, pretty much anywhere, you'll see something that's come from this region. And I guess what it means for Goulburn Valley Water is that whilst our traditional urban water sources are or services for households sort of relatively small, it's very much about those large commercial and industrial customers produce the food, and therefore we are very, very integral to the ecosystem that exists in this part of Australia.
Excellent. And geography wise, you're about 2 hours drive north of Melbourne. Now,
Yeah.
the topic we want to talk about today is tapping water security coast to coast in Australia, because you've had the experiences that you've just described. And you told me a wonderful story about how you'd had I think they were 200-year events that happened almost back to back, which begs you to believe that maybe the models that said they were 1 in 200-year events were wrong. I know you've got a bit of a structure to a story that you want to share here. So I'd like to now pass the conch to you. I won't interrupt, and let you tell your story.
Yeah, I think if I sort of go back to my time at Water Corporation back in the early 2000s, back then, and this story is very well known in the water sector globally, the rainfall runoff into the dams in Perth effectively stopped overnight in what I guess on reflection was a very abrupt and very brutal manifestation of climate change in Western Australia. And that triggered a very bold decision at the time, which was to fast track investment in large scale seawater desalination as the climate independent source, just because the traditional planning, water supply planning approach of, it rains in winter, you capture that in your dams and your aquifers, and you can supply through summer and have a bit of carryover year on year for water security. That was just a failing strategy on account of that climate change. So I was lucky enough to be involved in that big gamble, that first seawater desalination plant that was built.
Was that a world first?
It was indeed, yeah. At the time, it was the largest seawater desalination plant in the southern hemisphere. And I mean, there were seawater desal plants in the Middle East. And I think in 2005, Singapore PUB had commissioned the Sing Spring
Yeah.
desalination plant, but a very new technology for Water Corporation, very big dollars, of course.
You should
And
acknowledge that you were working with Suez, I believe, and you were the chair of the Alliance Board for 8 years, I think.
Yeah, many years. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I was originally part of the technical panel that was working with the proponents, and then when eventually the alliance was formed with Suez, I was on the alliance board, and then went on to chair the alliance board for a better part of 8 years, and that was very much about the operational and commercial performance of that plant, which was wonderful for the state. I mean, it essentially prevented Perth from becoming a brown city
Yeah.
into one that was more blue and green, and climate independent water sources in Australia were born from that initiative.
Yeah. And of course you did it once and then you repeated it.
Indeed, yeah, it wasn't too long after the successful commissioning of that Perth plant, the planning was accelerated for a second plant, a much larger plant. So in 2012, a 100 gigalitre capacity seawater desal plant was built a bit further down south, a bit further down the coast, and it was probably then that
Just to be
was the
clear,
real
that
confidence.
100 gigaliter was twice the size of the previous one, which would already been the biggest that anyone had built. It's,
Exactly. Yeah. So then, yeah, total of 150 when both stages of the southern seawater desalination plant was commissioned. And yeah, I think that's really when water security in the long term through climate independent sources or manufactured water sort of really took hold as being the cornerstone of water security, which then the other capital cities started to follow. So Sydney, Adelaide, Melbourne, Gold Coast now all have
yeah,
seawater. Right.
you paved the way, you cut the way through the jungle and paved the way. Now, I name checked Suez, which I probably shouldn't have done, but I name checked Suez. Was this second one with Suez as well?
No, that was with a Spanish consortia that has undergone a couple of name changes since. So yeah, the first alliance with Suez with the French, and then the second with a group, a Spanish group. And interestingly, a third alliance has just been formed to build a third large seawater desalination plant, this time in the northern suburbs of Perth. And so, yeah, there's a really strong capacity there for manufactured water now in Western Australia.
Okay, so at that stage, half of the water to Perth was being supplied through desalination. You'd set a template for climate resilient cities in locations like this, but you weren't done, were you? You decided you wanted to do some more stuff.
Yeah, I think in the interests of a good balanced portfolio of source options, the Water Corporation, probably as far back as 2005, started to think about purified recycled water or indirect potable reuse, and started a trial of indirect potable reuse in the northern suburbs. Back then, I was quite heavily involved in the treatment barrier performance, but also negotiating with the Department of Health performance criteria, because there were no drinking water recycled water guidelines at the time to use. And that trial was very, very successful, led to the building of a 14 gigalitre plant for injection into the aquifer, which has since doubled to 28 gigalitres. So that is now the only purified recycled water plant at operation scale in Australia. So yeah, again, another climate independent source from manufactured water in the interest of water security.
Now, brilliant. Let's come to Goulburn Valley. And what have you taken from what you did in Perth and brought to Goulburn Valley?
Yeah, I think the water security challenge here for Goulburn Valley is quite different. I think unlike Perth, our raw water sources are quite plentiful, relatively secure. We're part of the enormous Murray-Darling system
Yep.
here on the east coast of Australia. And there appears to be pretty good resilience in the foreseeable future for some of the smaller river networks that supply our towns. But I guess my observations are that the threat of water security for our region will manifest through gradual deterioration of source water quality, making treatment extremely difficult and eventually cost prohibitive, as opposed to a reduction in water quantity or loss of yield. And I think that that's a result of land use changes, increased urbanisation, land management practices, urban stormwater, all having an influence on
And
water
things
quality.
that you, as managing director of Goulburn Valley Water, you can only be responsive to. You can't actually change those. They're just outside your purview, aren't they?
Absolutely, absolutely. And, I know as a chemical engineer, theoretically, you can treat just about anything. Um, but as you know, the more contaminants in your source, the greater the number of treatment barriers, the greater the cost. And in an environment that we're in where we need to be operational 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, not fail because we're part of that integrated ecosystem, food production, I think we've got a lot of work to do around resilience to be able to treat those deteriorating sources and to think of ways of establishing new water sources in our context in the same vein as what we had done in Perth.
And so, what have you done?
Well, the planning has started now, I think, around really specifically understanding the resilience of our schemes one by one, augmenting them where we need to, but then starting to consider where do some of these advanced water treatment processes fit in our context, whether it is additional water recycling to take the load off potable water, and we've done that in a number of towns, or potentially even desalination for drinking water supply in the long term. They are very much part of our studies at the moment to build an equivalent balanced portfolio of source options where we are.
Wonderful. Well, you know what? Necessity is the mother of invention, is the sort of phrase. And there's a great story that you're telling here of being in a situation where the water sources just weren't there in Perth, and you had to show real bold innovation, the world's largest seawater desalination plant, and then doubling down, taking that experience and doing it twice as big a second time around, and then coming over to Goulburn Valley, where actually the work you do isn't just important to the citizens of people who live in the towns in Goulburn Valley, but it's also, as we said, on the fruit bowl, has an impact globally to food resources. So incredible. Steve, you've still got another 15, 20 years of your career left, but what advice would you give a young Steve Capewell?
I think it's would have to be don't forget the people. Looking back, working on those really complex, really challenging problems in Perth, new technology, new infrastructure uncertainty. It was easy to get lost in the technical, to double down on the engineering and the assets. And that had served us well in the past. But I think at the end of the day, those projects were characterized by presence of fantastically talented people working together, forming partnerships, communicating well. Ultimately achieving water security it's a pillar of a sustainable and prosperous city. And that's achieved through people
Team.
rather than assets. And I think, going forwards, we're not going to build our way out of climate change. We're not going to build our way out of those problems. It'll come down to people. So start growing and nurturing them now.
Excellent. Steve, it has been an absolute delight talking to you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Piers.
You have been listening to the Exec Exchange with Piers Clark. I have been talking to Steve Capewell, the Managing Director of Goulburn Valley Water in Australia. Please join us next time. Goodbye.